Have you ever seen more diverse or serious challenges to this country's security?
In my 50-plus years in the intelligence business, I cannot recall a more diverse array of challenges and crises that we confront as we do today.
We hear the term counterintelligence in the UAP subject thrown around all of the time. But what really is counterintelligence? What does it consist of? And why does counterintelligence need so many areas of focus, like the FBI and Homeland Security and so many more? In an exclusive interview with Joshua Pierson, a seasoned U.S. Army Chief Warrant Officer with 24 years in intelligence, delves into the essentials of counterintelligence, the significance of structured analytic techniques, and understanding UAPs, and the implications of national security. Join us as we get rebelliously curious. Joshua, thank you so much for joining me on Rebelliously Curious today. We've been trying to jump on the mic for a good couple months now since we met at SCU, or even just a little bit before SCU. We've been trying to figure out what our topic would be, and I think we came to a good conclusion. Before we get into just talking about counterintelligence and talking about anything that deals with counterintelligence and what it means and what it consists of, I'd like to talk to your title. You are an U.S. Army Chief Warrant Officer 4 with 24 years, this is amazing, 24 years of active service in the intelligence field. So can you tell me a little bit, what is a U.S. Army Chief Officer 4? Like, it's such a long title, and what does that consist of?
Yeah, so in the military, you know, you have your enlisted, and then you have your officers, right? And I'll speak to the U.S. Army, even though within the Department of Defense, all the rank structure is essentially standardized, and you're changing names on ranks. So, but in the U.S. Army, we have our enlisted ranks go from E1 to E9. Which, E1's a private, then you move to private first class. E1, E2 is a private, then E3 is private first class, and specialist, sergeant, staff sergeant, sergeant first class, master sergeant, and then sergeant major, then command sergeant major. And it's all based on different levels of responsibility, right? That's really how the rank structure works within the enlisted ranks, right? And then in your officer ranks, you go from lieutenant on up to general, and that's 01 to 010. Well, around 1917 or 18, and my warrant officer friends that are listening to this are going to be sure to shoot me notes to correct me. The Army noticed that they had a need for a technical advisor, right? Somebody who is a soldier, but doesn't have to, but isn't someone who is designed specifically to execute orders given by those above them, which is where our enlisted corps kind of fits. Is that officer gives an order, they're designed to execute. And then on the officer side, they're based on counting beans and bullets, putting people in places. The discussion comes into managing authorities, and under those authorities, what type of capabilities can we bring to bear within a given area. So the warrant officer started out as a technician designed around ordnance, as an ordnance technician, right, in World War I. And this ordnance technician was somebody who was not enlisted and not an officer, and was able to make decisions on the fly to figure out how to bring ordnance to the front, so that way we could continue fighting the fight. It then evolved into now there's a myriad of different warrant officer disciplines within the Army. I'm in the intelligence one, specifically in the counterintelligence discipline. And so in that role, my job is to manage the counterintelligence program under the specific set of authorities, regulation, and mission that the commander of the unit to which I'm assigned, to what he has, what his mission authorities are. I execute that, within the realm of how CI conducts its mission, right? So I have a portfolio that is highly technical. It's a practitioner's type of portfolio. It's a professionalization type of thing, and it's also a craft, right? So when we talk about what is counterintelligence and where it fits in the intelligence disciplines, right? These are all crafts. These are all things people do. It's why you don't see like philosophical discussions about how to think about intel or how to, how intel might inform other disciplines of, academics, because at the end of the day, intel may have its place in academics because you are writing a lot of papers and running it through an analytical process, but on the back end, you're informing a decision maker based off of your findings, on what it is that Red is trying to do, so that way they can make a decision about how to employ the force to counter what Red is doing, Red being the adversary.
Let's talk a little bit about like what is counterintelligence first, because a lot of people, I think they know what it is, especially in the UFO world. And I think all of us throw around that term. Counterintelligence this, Lou Elizondo is a counterintelligence official. Jay Stratton is a counterofficial intelligence official, but I don't think people actually understand that there's different types of terms and there's different types of people within counterintelligence. You have internal, and you have the FBI, and then you have the CIA, and then you have counterintelligence. So can we break down what is counterintelligence and what does somebody in counterintelligence do working for the US government internally, let's say within the Pentagon?
So I'm going to go off the definition that comes from the Security for Development, the Center for Development and Security Excellence. And they pull this definition from US code, right? So counterintelligence is defined as information gathered and activities conducted to identify, deceive, exploit, disrupt, or protect against espionage or other intelligence activities, sabotage or assassinations conducted for or on behalf of foreign powers, organizations, or persons or their agents, or international terrorist organizations or activities. So like any other good government definition, it's a mouthful. There's a lot going on in that particular, when we say counterintelligence within the government, that's what we mean, right? So first and foremost, so what happens with that? You break it down essentially into three areas of CI, activities. You have your offensive, your defensive, and your investigative, right? And that's essentially like where the functions fit on what is CI. The crux of that definition states that CI, that a CI professional has to be able to have a strong understanding of the myriad of ways that an adversary may attempt to penetrate systems of government, systems of academia, systems of corporations, and what we can do to either neutralize that penetration or exploit that penetration, right? So
Yep.
So we look at the beginning of that definition, information gathered, right? So what is information gathered? It's on its face, it's data points, right? And so when we're trying to assess areas that adversaries may be looking to exploit, foreign adversaries specifically may be looking to exploit, we do that through various information gathering means, right? Most of the time, it's just engaging with the population where we think foreign adversaries may be focusing on. And so you end up in some really interesting conversations with some people who have eclectic relationships, because you are looking to establish a profile on who it is the adversary is interested in, and then what you can do to either neutralize that interest point or exploit that, right? And then activities conducted are essentially things that we do to gather information to monitor, foreign intelligence activity. B, gather intelligence to exploit that relationship. C, gather intelligence, wrong term, information to neutralize that encounter. right? Or D, gather information to conduct an investigation based off of that particular encounter, right? And so when I say conduct an investigation, we use the US code to define what meets the parameter of an investigation, right? And what's required for that. You know, without delving too much into the investigations realm, it's you need to have reasonable suspicion that a conspiratorial relationship has occurred. And if that conspiratorial relationship has occurred, is when you start conducting the investigation against the action or the activity or against that relationship, and you're using what's known as least intrusive means, right? That's like, because you're doing two things within the U.S. You're doing everything you can to expect the rights and the right to privacy of U.S. citizens, right? So you know, if you have to look into somebody's background because it looks like the relationship may be a little conspiratorial, and you check in, you realize it's not, you can move on with no problem, right? So that's one part of it. It is the primary mechanism that we use to safeguard the right to privacy of U.S. citizens. The other reason why you use a least intrusive means approach is you don't want the foreign adversary being aware that you're looking into this relationship, because when they do, what happens? Well, they stop having the relationship and then they go to ground. And, you know, you read spy novels that talk about, you know, these really, you know, articulate communications plans, and that's what they're all trying. It's all ways to try and hide the relationship, right? So within the bin of the investigations part of CI, that's, you know, essentially how it's done, right? And so the other part of that is as you know, as we look further through the definition, you know, we have deceive, exploit, or disrupt. That's when you start getting into the offensive area, right? And the offensive area, it's also, you know, it's discussed in a lot of books. I could name 4 or 5 on the topic on different techniques or you know, theories or even, you know, practices of what offensive counterintelligence looks like and what it does. And essentially, what people know it as is a double agent operation, right? You know,
Can you explain what a double agent operation is? Because like that just sounds intriguing. I think most people would want me to stop there because they'd be like, what is a double agent operation?
So a double agent is somebody who is working for an intelligence entity, gets into a relationship with another intelligence entity, and then that relationship that they're in with the other intelligence entity turns them back against the one they were originally working for.
That happens?
Oh yeah, happens pretty frequently.
Really?
Right? Yes, yes.
What would be a situation something like that would happen?
Agent Zigzag. We'll talk about Agent Zigzag. Agent Zigzag was a man named Eddie Chapman. Eddie Chapman offered his services to Nazi Germany. Now, a little bit of background about Eddie Chapman. He was fluent in several languages, was well-traveled, pretty well-connected. And he offered his services to the Abwehr in Nazi Germany to spy on the British. When he got to, when he encountered the British intelligence services, and they pitched him essentially, right? And they were, and when I say pitch, that means that they met with him, and instead of immediately neutralizing his attempt to gain access or whatnot, they engineered the environment to let Eddie Chapman, Agent Zigzag, think that he was being successful, right? Then when the timing was right, the British and the Americans out of the double cross office, the 2X office, approached Eddie Chapman through an access agent, is what we call it, through a person who would made contact with Eddie Chapman and said, hey, we have some people that want to talk to you. So they brought him into the double cross office. And when they sat down with him and they were like, hey, we know who you are, we know what you're doing, and we want you to enter into a relationship with us, and you're going to go back and spy on the Abwehr. And Eddie Chapman said, okay, yeah, I'm in, and after he was trained and he was getting ready to be dispatched, towards the end of World War II. So he was recruited by the German intelligence service, sent to Europe or to England to conduct an intelligence mission. The English government caught wind of it, got to him, recruited him, and sent him back.
That's
So now
wild. Isn't that considered treason though?
well, I mean, so treason is, I mean, when you enter into a clandestine relationship with, well, I mean, so like treason in what sense? Eddie's background?
Like, it wouldn't, is that even legal? Because you're working for somebody that, you know, and you know all their internal secrets, and then you go to another opposition and you start working for the opposition. Isn't
No, it's
that,
not.
it's not a conflict of interest?
It's not. So, I mean, like conflict of interest isn't, I mean, like in the intel field, like that term has a completely different meaning, right? You know,
Really? Okay.
so our conflict of interest is really comes down to how close you might get to your source, right? So like you are asking somebody to enter into a relationship where they are spying on their government, right? So we have so Popov and Penkovsky are two of the most famous cases, two most famous agents that the US ran, right? They were run by a CIA officer whose name was George Kisvalter. Kisvalter ran Popov, and Pyotr Popov was a major in the GRU, which is the Russian Military Intelligence Service. And Popov was giving Kisvalter Russian plans and capabilities and ideas of what was coming out of both the Politburo and, you know, the information he had access to within the GRU. Kisvalter also controlled, had the relationship. That's where the conspiratorial relationship was built around with the man named Oleg Penkovsky. And Oleg Penkovsky, if I remember correctly, he was the individual that gave us information on the Russian nuclear program. Actually came from Penkovsky. Both of these individuals were captured by the KGB and shot. So it is a high risk game that you play when you're doing this. And if that were to turn into something like a double agent operation, right? If we're going to take it down that path, Popov and Penkovsky approached American intelligence by way of the embassy. Right? When the KGB caught wind of it, if the KGB would have said, hey, how about you guys work for us? Which, you know, in the KGB, you're going to work for us now. Okay. Typically how that relationship goes with the KGB. And then dispatch them back to talk with the US, that is what would have made that a double agent operation. But because they were strictly providing information, they were being treasonous to their government. So
Right.
Yes. So anytime, but see, that's the spy game, right? You know, and you know, during the Cold War, it was called a gentleman's game. It's a different footprint now. You know, I'm not sure gentleman's game is something that I would say to it. It's now, you know, expanded beyond just intel services, looking at intel services and trying to figure out and influence like intentions and plans of governments and military. You know, now there's a lot of focus on our academics, our scientists, our technological capabilities in the US, right? So in the eyes of the adversaries, everything's fair game, right? And it hasn't redefined, it's just expanded the definition of what a CI activity done to neutralize or exploit adversarial interest. It's just expanded that definition to include a different set of environments and relationships. You know, and I mean, I know a lot of this can sound, you know, kind of like I'm obfuscating stuff and you know, but at the end of it all, right, there's a reason why we classify things. And you know, what I'm talking about now, there's like 7 or 8 books that I could pick up and, you know, reference and say, yeah, here, this is, you know, where it's coming out of, right? And short of also, you know, experiences and those that I've worked with in the community who have experience in doing that particular part of the craft. So a lot of my expertise in the craft was focused more on detection and identification and neutralization, a little bit of exploitation, but it was not in the sense of moving to an operation, like an offensive operation. It was more, how do we set ourselves up to achieve a certain effect? That's, so, but within, the field, those people who touch that,
What do
oh
you think
man.
the shortcomings would be working in counterintelligence or just in general with the field, what some of the shortcomings are? And I'd also like to know some of the positives that you see, coming from counterintelligence. I like to get both because I think some people have a positive perspective of the job and then some people might have a negative. But where do you see first the shortcomings and then the positive aspects of it?
The shortcomings of the job: personnel, authority, expertise, experience, I think would be the big ones. Well, no, it's not. We are limited on personnel. I can't say much more than that, but it's a big footprint that you have to cover. The authorities can be kind of a bear to navigate. The FBI has primacy and is the primary authority for all CI activity in the continental US, right? And that's under their Title 18 authority. But they're also a dual-hatted investigative bureau, right? They still have a criminal element, and national security crimes and the execution of counterintelligence, at times becomes a second priority to, making sure that the FBI's criminal mission is completed, right? Because like when you look at the criminal mission, that has a direct effect on almost anybody in the US, right? The national security piece, it can take decades before you see the fallout. And a good example of that is Robert Hanssen, right? Spied for the Russians for 30 years. And he made it to a rather high profile position in the FBI too. And we're still figuring out the damage that he's done and the implications of what that is. But the average citizen isn't going to feel that effect. There's a difference between, understanding the effect of Robert Hanssen and understanding the effect of, the bombing in Oklahoma, right? Which was also an FBI case as well, right? The bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah building in Oklahoma in the 90s, right? Like the Oklahoma City bombing. They investigated that too, right? The FBI is also looking into the assassination attempt on former President Trump. That's pretty important when you compare that to, running an effective, counterintelligence bureau. Sometimes it rides second seat, and I mean, it can be a little difficult to work that through. But what I will say about the FBI is that after 9/11 specifically, and I'm no, I mean, let me rephrase that. Is that after 9/11 and the 9/11 Commission report came out and stated, hey, the U.S. intelligence community needs to work better at these problems. The FBI, in concert with other members that have requisite CI authority, have done well to form groups and coalitions to identify the threat and figure out how to neutralize or exploit it, right? So the shortage of personnel and the change in prioritization is often overcome by forming coalitions of the willing, of people who have of organizations that have requisite authority to do the job, and figuring out how we can all talk to each other to conduct the mission. And that's, I mean, that's a piece that I carry forward with, you know, the soldiers that are coming up in the profession, and trying to dispel a lot of the mystery and some of the stigma that they might have heard from, you know, or so, you know, out of the books they've read. Is it's like, no, when you start getting into it and actually doing the job, it's not at all like what you know, read in the media, or, you know, everybody talks about the failures. We have a lot of successes, you just can't talk about them, right? You know, and there's very good reasons why you can't. I mean, because people end up like Penkovsky and Popov. If you talk about these things, they end up in a gulag until the government is ready to get rid of them, right? And I don't want to say that as a fear factor, but it's a key point. Like, the stakes are high. You know, you have to stay detail oriented. You need to stay spun up on and you know, and threat is such a vague term. You know, in the dissertation I wrote about capability and intent. And in the intel, you know, in the CI field, it's like, how do you stay up on the threat? Well, you know, you also are not staying up on this abstraction, this subjective term of threat, but you're also looking at capabilities that the adversary can bring to bear, both in, you know, the classified realm and in the unclassed realm. You spend a lot of time reading and then writing about not only what you read, but also how it might fit into whatever else it is that it might touch. And it becomes a you know, you know, Herculean's the wrong term. It just becomes a bigger effort that requires more people to be effective. Is the U.S. effective at CI? That's not a question I'm going to answer for a myriad of reasons. I will say that we have good working relationships to do the job. And I think that's our strongest suit, is that we try not to stovepipe things, and that helps. You know, it keeps people. I mean, it does what it's supposed to do. But like I mean, you know, you get other people on here, they're going to talk about lack of resources, lack of funding, lack of this. We could always do more, and I could get into the intricacies, but I don't really think that this is the venue for that. I just know that, like, if we had more focus and emphasis on training designed to fully understand what a conspiratorial relationship looks like now, as opposed to what it looked like in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and then what we can do to neutralize and exploit that, and then have that iterative process be done, it'll better enhance, you know, not only our capability, but our allies as well, right?
When you talk about exploit, though, because we use that word exploit when people exploit each other, or cultures people exploit or appropriate cultures, do you use the word, how does counterintelligence define exploit then? And then how is it used? Could it be exploit of a situation? You know, I'd love to know, because I think it's probably different than what we would consider exploiting.
You know, you hear exploit, and typically, like in the you know, the public sector, it invokes, like, you know, of a particular human to do something that they're not consenting to do.
Right.
We're talking about trying to establish relationships built on mutual consent and mutual benefit to affect outcomes of organizations. That's what I mean by exploit, right? Is when you're working with somebody who is already putting their life on the line by engaging in a relationship with you, because they already are. I mean, you know, what they do could be defined as treason, you know, within their government. So there's you know, you're not exploiting the person. What you're doing is you're using the environment in which they live to find avenues to engage the adversarial entities, and then what we can do to, you know, manipulate that relationship, right? That aspect of it. Like, what can we do to get them to think a certain way, to act a certain way? You know, that's what I mean by exploit. Is it's not the person, it's not the relationship. right?
It's a
And you don't want to
situation.
push beyond what the person is capable of, because if you do that, there's a gulag, right? And that's important, right? And that's, that's why, if you're a CI in counterintelligence, if you're in counterintelligence, you have to have a certain level of empathy, right? Because you have to be able to relate to the person that you're talking to. And I've been in some pretty interesting interviews, that I would say in some regard harrowing interviews with, and I'm just a regular run of the mill, CI agent. And these are like Americans who bleed green when you cut them, US soldiers, and they're nervous talking to me, understandably so, because there's a lot at risk for them, because they know something or they've observed something that appears to be illegal or illicit or nefarious, and now they're coming to talk to you, and there's a very good chance they could be reporting on a friend of theirs, and so you have to have a certain level of empathy to be able to sit across from somebody and work through that, and let them know that they're not just out there flying blind, like doing it on their own. So now take that up a notch when you have somebody who you've entered into a relationship with to understand what the adversary is trying to do, and you're concealing that relationship. And then now that you've concealed that relationship, this person is the one engaging with the adversary. You don't want to exploit the person. They're already putting themselves in harm's way. So what you're looking for is what it is that they might be able to touch that you can then, engineer the environment to see what the adversary may do. Does that make
Wow.
sense?
It does make sense. Yeah.
So
There's
yeah, it's a
so much. No,
way to
it's
look at
great.
it.
It's great. There's
So,
so much into counterintelligence than I think people even realize at times. When looking at the UFO topic, counterintelligence officials are all over it. And I understand why, because you have people that are obviously foreign adversaries, right? That could be foreign adversary technology that we think is potentially UAP, but it's not. But our counterintelligence officials, and we see lots of them, Jay Stratton being one of them, and not dissing Jay in any form or any way, but our counterintelligence officials, the right people to be handling and disseminating the information about UAP from the Pentagon to the public. And we know Susan Goff is part of this, but we see so many former counterintelligence officers coming forward and speaking about it. Are they the right people in your perspective? And if they are, why? And if not, who else would be?
I'm not sure, quote, the right people is the way I would phrase that, right? Because
How would you
that
phrase it then?
invokes,
Yeah.
yeah, that invokes it's either this or that, right? So the study of UAP within the Department of Defense, and I would speak probably within whole of government across the span of decades, is designed, should have been designed to detect threat, right? And when I say threat, understand capability and intent, right? And so why does it appear that CI is touching it? Well, we have a phenomena that indicates a means of whatever the phenomena is, penetrates airspace and sea space with impunity. So which means it's imposing its will in a manner that the global cohort, the global community, I would say, is struggling to understand. By that nature, it looks like a CI problem. When you have something that has penetrated a myriad of technological, highly advanced technological capabilities, and is presenting itself, and I'm going to take a ding from my academic friends here with the use of this term, but that's okay, and manifesting itself like at locations and people, it tends to lend itself to more of a counterintelligence problem, right? So when we say, are they the right or the wrong, I think the best way to phrase it is that it sits in the CI wheelhouse, because a lot of stuff that is, not understood it may, look like a deception activity. It may be inaccurate or incomplete, fits within the realm of counterintelligence. In CI, what I like to tell my soldiers coming up is that, look, you're in a job where you have to prove a negative and you have to prove an intangible. That's where you spend your life. And just to give some examples of that, right? We've talked about what a conspiratorial relationship looks like, right? What we haven't talked about is all the stuff that goes into making that relationship be clandestine. So how are you supposed to prove that somebody is engaged in a relationship to where they're betraying the US government and have proof of that betrayal when all you have is inconsistencies in their behavior pattern?
And that's it. That's all
And
that
that's
you're
it.
going off of. But there's
So
no
now-
other
and so-
evidence.
Exactly. You have to gather the evidence. And how do we gather the evidence in CI? We talked about least intrusive means. You get more intrusive as it goes on, right?
So testimony is really important then when it comes to working in anything in counterintelligence. People's one-on-one conversations and the stuff that they're sharing back and forth and their experiences you take as major data points.
Yes. Yes. And we always need the evidence that the relationship has led to an exchange, classified information or sensitive information, right? We need that, right? But information in and of itself is intangible too, right? That's why we spend a lot of time, there's a lot of talk about like overclassification and that's all, like, the whole point of classification to protect the source and method. But information in and of itself is essentially intangible until you assign something to make it stick. Affidavit, memo, Excel spreadsheets, could be, ones and zeros on a computer screen, some widget that, does some really cool stuff in space, right? That's what makes information become tangible. Without that, all you're looking at is a relationship and trying to deduce as best as you can, but it really ends up being more of inductive reasoning. What the nature of that relationship is, is it conspiratorial? Is it on the up and up? What can we do to find out? Right? That's like the crux of the issue when we start talking about, how CI operates, where it's best aligned. So when we look at something like UAP, right, we have to remember, right, in the 1940s, it was unidentified flying object, right? And then the definition regressed, the term regressed, unidentified aerial phenomena. And then it regressed again, unidentified aerospace phenomena. And then now we're at unidentified anomalous phenomena, right? So on its face, it looks like a CI problem because we don't know what it is. We know that there's some anomalous sensor arrays that come off of whatever the phenomena is emitting. Larry Hancock and I have had some conversations about, there's a couple cases floating around that I haven't been able to fully read up on yet about where the anomaly, and I'm going to just use that term because that seems to best fit this case, hijacked the identify friend or foe capability of the aircraft and then started broadcasting a different signal. Like that is inherently counterintelligence.
Makes sense.
What
right?
just what penetrated our capability, our sensitive capability, and is now using it for its own, its own objectives. So that's why you see a lot of CI guys around it, because it's phenomenological, and we spend a lot of time dealing with understanding behavioral patterns, behavioral characteristics, relationships, what correlation looks like with this. Is it a correlation, causation, affiliation? And then trying to take it from that point of the intangible and then make it into something that, has weight to it, that has mass, essentially, that we can go, okay, so now we have, this is what we're looking at. So, our CI guys the right to look at it? I'd say that we have highly effective, highly experienced people in the U.S. intelligence community, really in a lot of intelligence communities, who have different opinions and perspectives on this problem. What makes CI unique to it is that we spend a lot of time in the intangible, right? Often what we do, right? So like Intel informs a policymaker of what to do, or Intel gives a policymaker an idea of what the adversary is trying to do, and then it's, up to the policymaker to work with his other staff to figure out what to do about it, right? You can use CI in some ways to maybe have an effect on the environment to help with that. There's other mechanisms, psychological operations comes to mind. People like to talk about that a lot, and especially surrounding the topic. That's all I'll say about it. I don't know anything about there's a lot of, I don't want to say noise, but there's a lot of discussion about the role of psychological operations, but that's one way of a myriad of ways to having an effect. And it's something that a policymaker would use in certain instances against a foreign adversary to achieve an effect, right? So
Can you explain too how policy affects counterintelligence? Because I think it's important just in context with what you're saying now as well.
So counterintelligence has agency based on the authorities and regulations in place. The policy would essentially be the process as to how we do our mission. So I think we're talking about policy in two separate veins. We're talking about policy and how a government, like what is the government narrative for a specific issue, which is different than what policy does in my line of work, right? So there's those are two stark, those are two different aspects of what policy is. And so when I say Intel informs a policymaker, right? The policymaker is the one who's developing the narrative and the action on what to do, right? About whatever issue. And so that after receiving, the hope is after receiving a finally, an evaluated intelligence product, the decision maker / policymaker reviews that, works it through the various councils. The National Security Council comes to mind, and that's typically where our policy comes out for what we do about adversarial interest. And when I say policy, that is the direction that we're going to go. And the reason why it's not law or regulation is because you can change policy a lot easier than law or regulation, right? So if we come across, like we came across, we'll go back to Penkovsky. He informed us, and I think he was the one that talked about the Soviet nuclear program. And because he informed us about that in the halls of government at the National Security Council is where the US government formed the narrative and the actions that were to be taken based off of what it was that Penkovsky provided, right? So that's a policy initiative, right? In CI, what a policy initiative does is it typically clarifies authorities, because we have a blanket of authority, but that authority only pertains to, specific, commands or equities in certain situations, and a policy would frame out what that looks like. It's different than what would be done to inform the National Security Council about actions to be taken. And National Security Council is derived from the National Security Act of 1947, right after World War II. And interestingly enough, that the impetus for that council and the National Security Act started with Wild Bill Donovan, who wrote a letter to President Truman in 1944 stating, hey, we need somebody who manages intel for the entire United States, and we need to figure out how that fits into the bigger piece of defense initiatives. And so that letter, coupled with a lot of discussion with Dwight Eisenhower and other key members at the time, led to the establishment of, what some people coin as a national security state. At the time, it was the body that sets the narrative and the directives for whatever we need to do to safeguard U.S. interests and the interests of our allies. So there's a lot of moving parts with the National Security Council, and there's the reason why we have that is so that way intelligence and defense isn't driving the show. right? It gave the president a person with his national security advisor to go to and state, okay, defense is telling me X, intel is telling me Y. These are the recommendations of what we should do. Okay, since you're the Z factor here, you come together with them and figure it out. And so that's where the National Security Council came from. And that's where policy is essentially set for what it is that we're going to do next. And, based off of whatever intel report or, intelligence analysis that comes into the council to talk about it. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. It totally makes sense. And it's a lot. I think there's so much, I think we look at, some people would just think people just talk to counterintelligence officials, right? And all they do is talk. There's so much more to it. And there's from policy to legalities. When we look at the legal aspect, like what is a legal apparatus that kind of initiates counterintelligence activities? Can we talk to that?
So there's three. The FBI is governed under Title 18. And that also governs our federal agents who are inside the Department of Defense. Title 10 is a service authority, right? And what that means is that the branches, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, even though they're Department of Homeland Security, Space Force, so the Title 10 authority under the Department of Defense for the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Space Force is an authority that states that the service branches have the requirement to train, man, and equip the militaries, and under that piece of training, manning, and equipping is the inherent authority to protect the force. And so counterintelligence assigned to the service branches protects the force under Title 10 authority. That's what gives them their investigations authority. Under Title 50. That's essentially we hear Title 50 talk about with the CIA and the whole intel piece, and Title 50 is also how combatant commanders employ the force in competition and conflict, right? That is what Title 50 authority does, right? There's a great article that I go back and I try to read annually called Demystifying the Title 10 and Title 50 Debate, because it talks about how it is that the Department of Defense may be able to conduct intelligence activities a little bit easier than the CIA in some veins, and how the CIA may be able to do it a little bit easier than the DoD in some veins. And it all comes down to, at what point are you reporting to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, right? That's essentially the if I were to put it in, sum it up into, 1 to 2 sentences, that is like the driving factor behind Title 10, Title 50. And now, some people, I'm sorry, there seems to be some noise about, we're just kind of amalgamating authorities to do this and do that. And it's all designed that way to make the conversation happen. The Pike and Church committees were, after the Nixon era, comedy, I guess would be the way to put it, the Nixon era comedy, and the Pike and Church committees came out and stated, hey, look, right, we need to have much stronger oversight. And so we're going to build that oversight into these into these laws. So that way you guys have to talk to each other and you have to report to us. And so what may appear as like obfuscation of things really comes down to, okay, a general officer wears 5 hats typically, right? Has 5 different missions under 5 different authority veins that he has to figure out which ones touch which, right? So how, Chris Mellon made a point a while back about, there's really no way that the SecDef can run the Department of Defense. It's over 4 million people, right? So how do you—
It's 4 million people?
4 million. There's 1 million people in the Army. Just in the U.S. Army, right? And so you start building civilians into that in our National Guard and Reserve Force, and it's something like, and I could be wrong there, and I'm sure somebody will have a problem correcting me on that, and I'd be good with that, right? But it's
in the millions. It's
millions, like
it's a lot of people.
And so when that's what you're you're running, you're not going to know everything that's going on. And that's why the Congress is there and is built in to make sure that when intelligence activities are conducted, that they're coordinated properly and they're legal, moral, and ethical, right? As best as they can be, right? And of course, you know, we talk about conspiratorial relationships and then we can get into like the ethics and morality of that. But, you know, to safeguard American interests and allied interests, you know, what can we do to make sure they're legal and we're not violating, you know, human rights or U.S. citizen rights, or, you know, and you know, with our allies in certain circumstances. And the whole design of of HPSI and CISI is to make sure that the organizations are talking to each other and it's legal.
There are these conversations around titles, right? You know, we have within the UAP topic, we hear, I think, Title 50, and then we hear, I think, Title 10, and those are things that stop the conversation from moving forward in government. Do you know why that's the case within specific titles, that it's stopping those, or is it stopping those conversations? Yeah.
It's all based on authority, right? And so it's based on the authority stipulated in the Title 10 and Title 50, right? And so it's a government of the people. And so we have to understand that when we're looking at the Department of Defense or the executive branch to look at this problem, it looks inherently like an intelligence, it looks like a national security problem, because there are no intelligence problems. Intelligence is just a practice, right? It's what you do to make sure that the stuff you're saying is as factually accurate as possible, right? That's what intel is, you know. And we can talk about like structured analytic techniques a little bit in that regard. But so it looks like a national security problem. Well, there's really two agencies three that are designed to focus on national security problems: ODNI, CIA, DOD, right? Office of Director of National Intelligence, Central Intelligence Agency, Department of Defense, right? So the Department of Defense has roughly 80% of the intelligence community underneath the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Security. It's a massive portfolio that the person who sits as the USDI has. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence has a coordinating authority for all intelligence activities in the U.S., right? And this is all public law, right? I mean, if you know, people want to spend time reading public law, you know, hopefully they'll check up and make sure I'm saying the right thing, and then, you know, whatever, right? But like, it's all public law, right? So ODNI, and then James Clapper in the position said, you know, my job is essentially lead coordinator. Right? I have to make sure people are talking to each other. And then you have the CIA, right? And the CIA has their mission done under Title 50. And the reason why that they were listed in Title 50 was not only to give them teeth in the intelligence piece, but also to give them teeth in the covert action piece. And that's a different conversation for a different day, and why that's important. But to look at this as a national security problem, which has essentially been the only way the government has looked at it, you're going to be bound by Title 10 and Title 50, which are designed to determine threat to the homeland, to U.S. interests at home and abroad, and to allied interests at home and abroad, right? And so you're gonna be looking at it from that standpoint. And so when they say Title 10 doesn't go far enough, Title 50 doesn't go far enough, it probably shouldn't go any further, right? We have 19 members of the U.S. intelligence community. That's a lot of members, right? And those members are across the departments. I mean, the Department of Energy has an intelligence component. So does the State Department, right? It's not just CIA, DOD, and ODNI, right? But everything with it on the UAP topic has been compartmentalized to the DOD, because the approach has always been, is this a national security problem? And we can make that argument. I make the argument in my dissertation that it may not be a threat problem, but it may be a risk proposition, right? We don't know intent. We think we know capability, but it seems to be more of a risk to national security. So why are we continuing to only poke the Department of Defense, the CIA, and ODNI to look at this when they are bound specifically within the parameters of Title 10, Title 50, based on the authority stipulated within Title 10 and Title 50? You can't send government people like who are affiliated with the DoD, or like, you can't send DoD employees who are intelligence people to Skinwalker Ranch. It's a privately owned equity. That's a posse comitatus issue, right? And so I'm not knocking if that's happened. I don't know. I'm not really concerned if it did. What I'm speaking to is that if we want this problem solved in a more effective manner, I mean, and I'm just going to toss this out there, the National Sciences Foundation could very easily look at, garnering appropriations to fund research at Skinwalker Ranch, and then use a government entity to do it if they wanted to, I think. Tell you what, let's just end with the National Sciences Foundation piece, right? And I think that's the crux of the issue, is that we keep looking, like we look at offices like, we had Project Grudge Sign, Blue Book, and then we have this, study out of, the Condon Report, which, like my argument is in my dissertation is essentially with the Condon Report, when it stated there's no reason to study it, there's no threat. And I'm like, well, no, I have a taxonomy. I mean, I have a budding taxonomy, and I think this is worthy of studying. And, like it's like, I'm not sure, we could talk, and there's a lot of thought as to why the Condon Report went in that direction.
Well, and that was the Air Force. I think it's so great. There's so many things to that. We had the Air Force looking at this, and then, we're having the Condon Report that's coming out. And now we have obviously counterintelligence officials that's sitting in the DoD. And is it the right area? I think that's a really great conversation that we need to have. And where does it progress out of the DoD? Where does it go next? And you're right, is it science committees? Is it academic committees that take hold of this? And then we move it to different departments so that we can have the stigmas removed from it. And, there still might be an understanding that there might be a threat, right? Because threat is different than how we in the civilian way would perceive threat. I think and we'll talk about that and how we analyze threat, but we can still keep it in that department, but it can be moved and grown into other departments that, you're right, that take on these responsibilities to look into it from an academic perspective or from an intel perspective. There's so many different areas. It is an area of study. So we need other areas and agencies in with the government, if they're not already, looking at it and taking it and having a responsibility in those areas and taking it seriously. So I do think you're right that it needs to evolve and move and not just stay within the DoD.
And I want to speak to that for if I could, for just a little bit more, right? The National Security Council, the Department of Defense, and the intelligence community, right? The entire design of that is to detect threat. So they're going to do that, right? And that should be something that is part of the UAP conversation. It shouldn't go away. It shouldn't have primacy, but it's one of a myriad of members who are trying to figure out what this is and what we can do to resolve and better understand it, right? That is one part. It's a struggle for me when I see the work like UAPX does, and I see the work that Galileo Project does, and I see the work that these independent citizen scientists do, and I see the work that the academic community is trying to do, and the majority of us are volunteers because it seems to only reside within DoD, and at this point in the game, I don't think that's by design anymore. You know, we can make that argument in the past, and maybe it was by design, maybe it's this, you know, and you know, there's a lot of books on that, and that can be a separate conversation one day. But looking at something like getting, you know, government funding through the National Sciences Foundation would work that piece. And also the studies need to be independent, like government and academic sector, like it's two independent entities that are collaborating to figure out what this is. And when I say government, and that's a big term. Right now, all we have in government that we know really looking at the problem is the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, right? So right now, that office acting independently from academics who are acting independently from Aero, but they're talking to each other, right? That should be the goal, right? Is that there's crosstalk, but one is not subjected to the other. It's you know, professional exchanges, because you know, DoD, no matter what office is there, is going to be going, all right, is this something that you know is going to, you know, cause grave harm to the national interest? That's going to be their focus. It's never going to change. We should never ask that to change. You know, we have other, you know, I mean, I don't want to, we have the other government entities have means of funding research in the academic veins to understand what this is. And that should also be an avenue as well.
Right. And it should be part of it. You know, we look at Sean Kirkpatrick, who wrote the recent report, which was kind of a nothing burger. And also it wasn't done well. It was, let's be honest, you know, historical dates. I think they even screwed up Roswell of when the date was of when the Roswell incident happened. You know, like these are all this is all public information that he could have pulled from or his team could have pulled from. So you're right. We need to look at other agencies and other areas to be able to help us, you know, and not silo it. I would think we've seen issues that other departments aren't talking in the past, and there's been problems with that. This is the same kind of conversation. If we can start now and start having different agencies in different areas sharing information about UAP and working on even similar pulling from smaller budgets, even having smaller offices within those areas where people are focusing on the topic. You know, it doesn't have to be hundreds and thousands of people. It can be a group of people that are within different administrations that are working together and saying, hey, let's take some time, because let's be proactive and not reactive, because the day that we ever really do need to figure this out and it becomes a major threat, at least we have a lot of stats and we're not scrambling to find people and find others to be able to help us to figure out this problem. North America is horrible at being reactive to, and I say this about Canada, especially being Canadian, we see it within our government drastically. We see it even on Ontario with Doug Ford, you know, provincially, you know, we just react. We don't know how to plan. And I think this is a time where might be ahead of the curve, you know, depending on how much internally the government does know about UAP activity, but we can be ahead of the curve and we can plan for things that are good and negative so that we have some kind of action plan and we don't scramble and come out with nothing burger reports like Sean Kirkpatrick did.
Agreed.
The paper that you recently worked on and that you were writing, it's called Building an Intelligence Picture. And making sure I'm saying this properly, is Building an Intelligence Picture of Capabilities Through Structured Analytic Techniques.
Yes.
And this is based on threat, right? Threat is the overall theme, I believe. And then you're looking at it through structured analytic techniques. How do you go about doing that? And then what are the structured analytic techniques that you're pulling from to analyze threat in a UAP capacity?
Oh, there's 68 structured analytic techniques.
That's a lot.
I won't name them all. You know, when I started in the intel field in 2000, you know, we had 12. Prior to that, it was known as alternative analysis, right? So that's like the history of where structured analytic techniques came from. And it grew into around 30-ish, and then now on the third edition of, and I'll go ahead and read off the title here, on the third edition of Structured Analytic Techniques for Intelligence Analysis by Randolph Pierson and Richard Hewer. We are at something like 68 and really all it is it's a thought process. It's and I do mean like a thought process that is designed to acknowledge and mitigate biases, right? So that's essentially the crux of it. And so you can use a structured analytic technique to study almost anything. And so when you have something that is phenomenological, like UAP reports and encounters, it's rich to use this type of approach because you start by developing your key assumptions, and then you build a curation method to figure out what reports meet the standard for inclusion into the analysis. And then you have an analytical methodology. So I had two. I had a analysis for competing hypotheses. I tried to use scenarios and indications, but scenarios and indications is designed to determine intent. And that's not necessarily a one person type of thing. You need a team to do that. The intentions team with the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies is doing an excellent job of applying scenarios and indications, structured analytic techniques to better, frame out what intent would look like. Using the same technique, I built an analytical architecture for how to, develop those profile groups that are referenced in the slides and discussed in the dissertation. When I start talking about, when people say triangle, this is what they mean. When they say UAP, this is what they mean. When they say disk, this is what is being stated about it, right? The win with using a structured analytic technique is that you're not married to your findings, because the use of a structured analytic technique or applying this type of approach opens the aperture to use inaccurate, incomplete, and deceptive information, right? And so I can attest that there have been times that I have, in my 20-odd years in the military, that I have written some papers, to inform our policymakers or, our commanders of what to do, just for, the team that I was sitting with to be like, 80% of this is deceptive. And we know that for these reasons. And I'm like, all right. And then you go back to the drawing board, start over at step one, and go all the way through, right? And so that's what makes this type of technique unique into what it does. And then lastly, like, I'm not saying that I agree with the findings or I disagree with the findings. It is strictly, this is what people say, right? So you could use this same technique looking at abduction cases. Like, this is what they say. Like, they say these are the commonalities across X number of reports, across X number of people. These are the commonalities. Whether or not I agree with it is irrelevant. And that's what's key about determining capability and intent of an adversary. What I think is relatively irrelevant to what it is that the data points that the adversary is presenting that I'm analyzing. That's key, right? And so when people look at something like the intention study, and they may say, well, it's flawed because it doesn't have reports from this year or this era. I mean, define flawed. What criteria are you basing the flawed nature? Because it may not include reports from like 1947, right? Because when we established that curation standard, a lot of those reports just didn't make the cut. And that curation standard is written and will be published. So that way other people can come behind the intention study and do the same thing we did. And that's what makes the dissertation unique, is that I could give you my databases and you could mimic the same process. You may come up with different findings and conclusions, but you could do the very same thing I did, look at the very same cases, get the same initial parameter to pare it down to a sample. You could do it all based off of reading that dissertation and me giving you the databases. And that's what makes a structured analytic technique, is that you can follow my thought process from, A to Z all the way through to the end.
Is this even being applied within the DoD or anywhere else, or is this something that you're proposing for them to look at? Like, and I know obviously SCU is, and we're looking at the intentions project that you're working on, but is it something that the DoD or anybody else in counterintelligence has been like, hey, let's apply this to the UAP subject?
Yes, yes. It is the industry standard for the U.S. intelligence community, and it is being applied. I'm not going to speak for government agencies, government entities. They're more than like, I mean, they can speak for themselves as to the application. But based off of Intelligence Community Directive 203, which you can find on the ODNI website by just going to it, typing it in ICD 203, which is analytic standards for the intelligence community, it is being applied. And so, and one of the crux of the issues off of the Arrow report, and this is the only thing I'll say about it, is that the rub is that it looked like analytic standards weren't applied. And so when we talk a lot about there were misspellings here, this references X, Y, Z, right? Like it looked like they weren't applied. That's all I'm going to say about that. And that was one of the primary one of the, let me not use that word. That was one of the primary issues between ODNI and the report that Kirkpatrick published. Because I'm also not going to speak for the Arrow employees, right? That's not,
Right.
So is that when on its face, when we read it and we look at ICD 203, it doesn't look like it jives. But that report's not an indication of the work Arrow does.
That's actually a really great point. That is a great point. You have different people that are running an office, right? And so their leadership is going to influence everyone else around them, or it's going to be a representation of everyone else around them. But they should be using best practices. That's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to take the best practices that they have available to them and use them when analyzing and doing any type of report. It doesn't matter if it's UAP or not. If you have that accessibility and you have a structure that works and is proven to work, then you apply it to everything else until you develop a structure that's better than that.
And I, it is being like the techniques are being used, but I'm not going to speak for like government entities, right? If they choose to come and talk about it, that's a win, because it's demonstrating that that the methodology that they're using can now be open to scrutiny by our academics and our professionals, right? That's key in this piece, right? Is that we all kind of got to be an open book with approaching this problem. We got to make sure that government can still classify things to protect sources and methods. That's important, right? We can't get away from that. Talking about methodology, will help to remove some of or may help to remove some of the perceptions that people have, when it comes to whatever comes out of government offices. But yes, they are being used. I know they're being used, but I'm not going to speak for anyone, like any entity outside of, I know they're being used.
Any government agency has so many abilities and capabilities to do things. Its communication is number one, right? What is our guideline of what are we doing? How are we communicating this to each other? And are we being effective? And are we being efficient? I'm German Italian, so my German side of me screams for efficiency in almost everything I do or want to do in my life, unfortunately.
Nice.
It's good. It's a curse and it's a blessing at the same time. So when you have like 1 million people or more within any form of government that's working, I think you said 4 million, if that, or 1 million just within, right? Just like, it's a lot of people. So you're going to have a lot of confusion, a lot of misunderstandings. Work's not always going to be the best, but there should be structures put in place to prevent that, and that's something that has to be done, maybe more project managers in the DoD. But my last question to you is about counterintelligence. So within the UAP topic, What could counterintelligence do better now to make this topic manageable for civilians, manageable for other people in government? What can counter official intelligence officers do now to
Oh
help
God,
the future
I don't.
of the UAP topic? Yeah.
Let's start with this. Know the environment you're in with this particular topic. Go in with your mind wide open. Do what you can to mitigate bias. And I say that because when I started this topic, right, and a friend of mine introduced me to UAP as a legitimate area of study, when I was complaining about writing my dissertation on social movement theory. I had put 4 years into building a research proposal that treated social movement theory like an international relations problem. And I hung it on the evidence that social movements tend to lean toward violent acts to achieve political objectives. Right, wrong, or indifferent, right? And that, and I know it kind of devolved, but I'll bring it back around. Right, wrong, or indifferent, and there's no judgment applied to that. Evidence indicates violent acts occur, originating from social movements to, achieve some sort of political end. Well, that vein, it looked like an international relations problem. And so I'm, talking, I'm like, it's interesting, but it looks like I'm just going to check a block. I mean, nobody's going to really read this thing, and a friend of mine was like, have you considered unidentified aerial phenomena? I was like, wait, come on, like UFOs? I mean, there's movies about that. Like I saw Close Encounter of the Third Kind. I mean, that's pretty cool, but I mean, like, what, is it you for real? And he handed me the Nimitz case. He was like, give this a read. I gave that a read. Then he handed me Larry Hancock's book, and went over this at the SCU conference. Larry Hancock's book, and then I read Leslie Kean's book, and started framing down to even talk to Rich Hoffman. And I got a couple hours for him to tell me his story. And I mean, I've probably heard him tell a story 6, 7 times now. It never gets old, right? And I appreciate him allowing me to walk up and, after just meeting him, ask some very hard pointed questions that might have been a little uncomfortable. Because the goal is to acknowledge the bias and then, seek to remove it, to dispel it, right? And as I went through this process and started framing it down, and I get to, well, we have this phenomena that is moving in and out of sovereign airspaces. At the time, it was just airspaces with impunity. Like nobody can do anything about it. That indicates threat. And it was at that point is when I said, okay, I gotta, I have to look at this with, mind wide open. And sometimes it can get a little esoteric in the conversations. It can get highly subjective. You can end up talking about like speculative stuff, and like the intel community has a significant role in this study. Unlike other areas where science has needed the wildly imaginative and speculative to move it along, and it was separate from anything to do with like government or intel or whatever. I mean, look at how we went to space. It was, basically JFK saying, build something to send us there. That's, I mean, same thing. I mean, Steve Jobs with the iPhone. I want my, Bill Burr says it best. I want my entire music library in that device. Like, I mean, that's wildly imaginative and highly speculative that we were able to send someone to the moon almost 8.5, 9 years after JFK was like, I want rocket ships. So in this particular area, if you approach it with a bias, it's going to manipulate your results. And I think that that's key, right? Like, do I agree with all the speculation surrounding it? No. I mean, do I have a bias about some of it? Yeah, I acknowledge it. And then I do what I can to work through that and keep my mind wide open, because there's a lot of really interesting and unique and strange relationships that occur when we talk about UAP. And one of the key findings in my dissertation that has given me pause and is going to have me go back and look at data sets is 75 of the cases that I reviewed for possible inclusion were excluded because of what is known as Close Encounter 3 protocol, right? And J. Allen Hynek developed this protocol, CE 1, 2, 3. I think we're up to like CE 5 now. I think where we're at, right? 75 cases were excluded only because there was a biological implication. The observer witnessed a biological entity, met all the other curation rules except for that one. Now, my bias is telling me they're seeing things, right? Like that there's nothing else to it. We just need to focus on X. But like the investigator in me is going, every other rule in my curation standard was met. There might be something here. And so these 75 cases relate to the triangle, disc, and spheres that were observed and cataloged and sorted and came out to be profile statements in my dissertation, right? So now I can go back to my data set and go, which of these biological encounters were observed with triangles, which with discs, which with spheres? And what's important about that is, again, I don't have to like the answer. And people may look at me and go, well, you're a nut job. You don't know how accurate that report is. I'm working with inaccurate, incomplete, and at times deceptive information. That is what the intel community works with. We can always go back. Maybe not with these cases, but over time, it may be proven that there's really nothing there, and that it is some sort of psychological, encounter that just, happens, and there's really nothing we can do with it, or it can be something else. But applying a bias when you get stuff like that means that we're never going to really know what it is we could or couldn't be dealing with. And so what could we be doing better? Mitigating the bias, taking the information at face value, doing the work to validate the veracity of the information gained and the credibility and reliability of the source, and then moving on and then cataloging it for further analysis. I think that's what I would say we could be doing better.
Well said. Well said. I think so too. I'm like, again, not my area of expertise. From what I've seen, for sure, things are not taken seriously, or we don't know what it is. When people ask me, what do you think it is? I said, I don't know. My opinion doesn't matter. And you're saying the exact same thing. Our opinions don't matter. The data matters, and people's testimony, which are data points, but then other images, footage, all those other things that we can get, that we can look and cross correlate. And then, as you're saying, right, come to an intentions idea, or also then see what all the correlations are to point to what are the common things that are related to UAP. And that's where we're at now. I think we've been there for a very long time, but we're doing it better now. And then we also do have the American government and other agencies looking at this, or other people, I should say civilians, not agencies, but other civilians looking at this as well. So, we're at the starting point. I think we've been doing this for a very long time, and civilians and governments have been looking at this for more than 75 years, but we are at the start of looking at this from a very serious perspective, and that's publicly known. I think we've always taken it seriously and it's gone through ebbs and flows, but now everyone's starting to take it seriously. So we're just starting at that, and then it will progress over time, and then we'll learn more data. But the part that you said about biologics, I think that that's very interesting. You know,
It's
there's,
it's it is
woo,
it
and
was
it's
it was
scary at the same time.
you know, I mean, it was irregular, right? And I mean, it it puts you on your heels when you know, because you see the myriad of books that talk about it, and then who are trying to, like, you can see how they're trying to develop the relationships, and but it all just kind of fits under this buzzword of UAP, right? Nick Gold, and I hope he doesn't get on me for doing this, but I'm going to just drop his name anyways. So Nick Gold has talked about writing a taxonomy and an ontology of UAP, and why that's important is that we don't know what we're talking about yet. We have a lot of people, brilliant people, and you know these you know I'm you know, wildly important is what's coming to mind, but that's not it. Who are in these fields of study that are doing groundbreaking, cutting edge work in you know, getting sensors to do things, and you know, redefining what phenomenology is, and understand, or I mean, maybe not redefining it, but better understanding the subjectivity of the human condition, right? And trying to draw all that together. And that's one of the things the Society for UAP Studies is doing, and especially like at this conference is you know, the term epistemology and philosophy comes to mind with what it is that the society is trying to do, and what they're looking to do at their conferences, to get the conversation, continue the conversation about essentially how to think about the problem, right? We've regressed in our definition. That's not bad. That's good science, because we're now all finally saying we don't know what it is. Well, if we don't know what it is, how you know, you can't really have any experts on UAP if you don't know what UAP is, number one. And number two, if it has so many different veins of interest, you can't really apply a big bias to it, because you have to kind of understand it all, or you kind of have to look at all of it. And so that's where like the wildly imaginative comes in. It's like, okay, well, this guy's gone you know, gone down this path, and now we have like 18 different forms of what ET looks like, right? I mean, you know what, how do I feel about that? I think it's irrelevant to the grander conversation, because I know what my capability is when I look at the problem, right? And at this point, right, that the wildly speculative has its place, you know, but at the same token, it's important to come back and say, okay, what is it that we truly know and understand about, you know, what it is that we're looking at? And then in the SCU, you know, and you're a member of the SCU, as you know, is on point with saying, okay, look, we can focus on the material aspects of what this is. And, you know, if we have, I mean, and the SCU was wholly supportive of me presenting my dissertation. But if you look at it, it's a scientific process more than a method, right? And the reason why it got through is because the SCU applied the same rigor to what it was I was going to be presenting that they do to any of the projects that they bring in, right? And it's creating a space to where you can have thoughtful conversations, to where you know that as that we're all collectively working to try and define UAP, but we're finally at a starting point where I would say that you can start, you know, doing the legwork. Because when it was UFO, you know, it was like, okay, well, there's some propulsion implications, and then now we're at a subjective abstraction, and I'm not even sure those are the right terms with unidentified anomalous phenomena. But you know, we have very smart people in areas of expertise that are looking at this and are opening themselves up to both the more prosaic conversations and these speculative ones, to just do idea generation. And that's where it needs to go.
I agree. and I should say my actual last question to you, and feel free to answer this or not, but do you feel that there's any counterintelligence officials in the field now that are pushing disinformation in regards to the UAP topic that you're like, hey, this is not, and we don't have to name names, but do you feel that that it's out there and it's coming from counterintelligence?
I don't think I'm going to answer that one.
Okay.
I think that puts me in a very dangerous space. That puts me
That's
in
fair.
wildly speculative. So,
It is, but I have to ask. I'm like, but Joshua, thank you so much for joining me on Rebelliously Curious today. And thank you for being rebelliously curious with me. I'm always fascinated about counterintelligence. So you enlighten me in so many other ways and so many other people that listen to this podcast. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Chrissy, thank you for letting me come on and us finally getting this together for me to come on and talk with you. It's always a pleasure to get and sit with you. And I hope we can do this again.
Me too.
Yeah.
Me too.
So,
For sure. We will.
all right. The views and opinions expressed in this interview are mine and do not reflect the views or opinions of the Department of the Army, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. intelligence community.